if you look at Africa, generally the two main hubs right now for blockchain are Kenya and Nigeria. And everyone is talking about going after these emerging markets of Nigeria and Brazil. So this is like my running joke that they're like the fake emerging markets, right? Because Nigeria and Brazil are humongous economies. And they're just emerging because people are just thinking that the US is tapped out, Western Europe is tapped out. What's next? They go Brazil and Nigeria because they have these huge economies. But ultimately, that's not what we're focused on.
Today's guest is Torab Torabi, the CEO of Move Industries, which is the core contributor to the Movement Network. Torab, welcome on.
Hey, Jackie, how are you? How's everything?
It's good. It's good. I believe the last time you came on the show was in November 2025. So at the time, we talked about the company's move forward, no pun intended. I'm sorry, maybe bad joke, from, previous leadership, all the things that happened in the past. Fast forward to today, 6, 7 months since November. How would you kind of describe the business's evolution? You've been CEO now for a little while.
Yeah, it's been quite a while since kind of taking the reins. And what is the company itself, and then what is the industry as a whole? I think we discussed this last time as well. I
Yeah.
hate to even call it a meta because it's so ridiculous to consider revenue a meta. That's just how every business in
Mm,
human history has ever operated, where you have to make money in order to be a sustainable business. But what we've also seen is the demand for block space has really gone down. And ultimately, people want utility, which again seems really basic. And to someone not in crypto, they'd kind of laugh and ask you, what were you guys doing before this? And
mm,
so, from our side, what we've seen is obviously a huge demand on stablecoins, on payments, remittances, these types of things. And honestly, it is difficult because it seems like the space is so crowded. But from our side, we've seen overwhelming interest from different parties around the world. And so I'm happy to get into it. And I think last
yeah.
time we talked, we had just announced the cast partnership, which has been amazing. The entire cast team, Rags, Pepper, she's in the
Hmm.
background, but these are amazing people to work with. And I highly recommend their product as well. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I know Rogs from Cass. He's cool. And yeah, there's also the recent and very big news that Movement just secured across or access to licensing payment rails across the US, Canada, and EU. Maybe we start with that, and then I know there's another component to it too. But what was kind of like the impetus behind this?
Sure. So, as you've probably seen, we have announced a strategic reorientation in terms of how we operate as a chain. So, as I mentioned before, the general purpose thesis is, I don't want to say it's dead, it's on life
Mm.
support. And there's only a few people who I would say
Across
are.
all chains. Yes, yes,
Yes,
yes.
yes, yes. So, like,
Uh-huh.
obviously, for example, you have Ethereum and you have Solana, and you
Hmm.
have Monad, I would say, is throwing their hat in the ring where they're being more general purpose and not specific for use cases. And of course, there's Sui as well. But ultimately, there's too many chains. I think we've known this for a while, and it's just a matter
Right.
of where do you fit into this equation, this global tapestry of finance. Where does everyone fit in? So for us, what we saw is overwhelming demand on the payments and also yield after I would say the partnership with Cast and kind of the integration with Circle, which was really big, we saw a lot of inbound interest. And so what we decided is the only way to be able to grow strategically is to have access to licensed payment rails. And so right now, that means that we will be able to operate in the US, Europe, and Canada. And so that's step one. And there's a few uh, bigger dominoes that have yet to fall, or at least that we haven't announced yet. And so for us, essentially, everyone talks about, oh, stable coins. Okay, so Jesse Pollock from Base, he got a lot of flack for this on Twitter, where he
Yeah.
talked about, oh, it costs 6% and 5 days to send money from one country to another, but on Base, you can do it in a microsecond or whatever, like sub-second. But the reality is that every blockchain can do that, right? Almost
Mm.
every single blockchain outside the
Not
big
unique.
ones like
Yeah.
Ethereum and BTC, they can send money. That's not the issue. The issue is how do you on ramp, how do you off ramp, and this, the term that's been beaten like a dead horse is the last mile, right? How do you get that last mile payout? And so from our side, we realized that instead of being dependent on other partners, we want to go down the path where we're the masters of our own destiny and we will have access to these payment rails to be able to get money not just on ramped into blockchain and stable coins, but also be able to send them into specific corridors that we're going to focus on.
Yeah, so the press release brought up the access to licensed payment rails across the US, Canada, and EU. And then there was also the component, or completely separate, but there was also a mention in the press release that said there was something about a token buyback, right? Tell me more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're really proud to be able to announce this, that essentially what we did is the Movement Network Foundation bought back 19% of the investor token allocation, which is pretty significant, which actually equates to 4.1% of the total token supply, give or take. Now, the other context is that we had the Binance move buybacks as well, and we had the public strategic reserve, which was about 1.9%. So in aggregate, the foundation has purchased 6% total of the token supply. And obviously, from our side, this is really important. Number one, it's us betting on ourselves, betting on the movement ecosystem, and making the Move token the crown jewel of the ecosystem. And so every single thing that we do will accrue value back to the Move token. And so that's front and center for us as an organization. At the end of the day, I believe that everyone should eat their own cooking. I don't believe in people when they, the saying that the cobbler's kids have no shoes. Nope. So if we're bullish, then we should put our money where our mouth is. Like as an organization, I think that should be across the board. I think that's pretty big, and I'm really proud that the Movement Foundation basically did that.
Yeah. You think they'll do it again? Is this going to become a recurring trend?
I'll do my Trump. I cannot confirm or deny these allegations. Thing. So all I can say is again that everything that we do, it's going to accrue value back. So another part of this is that we verticalize the stack. So our money market and the vault infrastructure, all of that has been brought in-house. So all revenue that's generated from that goes back towards the Move ecosystem. So again, the ultimate goal is how do we create value, and then how do we attribute that value back to the crown jewel of our ecosystem, which is the Move token.
Yep.
So that's like top of mind. At the end of the day, it's about capital allocation and about trust. And so this is what we're focused on.
Yeah. I mean, what was kind of the writing on the walls then for you guys when you saw the opportunity on the payments front? I know some teams out there are also like focused on payments or pivoting into it, like maybe they started in payments or maybe they moved into it. But for you guys specifically, like what was kind of the opportunity, moving away from that general purpose kind of sphere that most of these chains operate in or did in the beginning?
Yeah, so the ground shifted beneath our feet, and what we had to do was go on our eat, pray, love journey and really do some soul searching. Where do we fit into this whole story, right? And so for us, we said, okay, let's start from ground zero. What do we have? We have a blockchain. We have the Move language, which was specifically created for payments, right, by Facebook, or now it's Meta, right? And then ultimately they got shut down by the government. And so we have that. We have USDC, and we have distribution in terms of community in a lot of emerging markets specifically. So what happened is we actually started seeing a bunch of inbound interest. And so I can say it now, I've been meeting with a few different governments. So just recently, the one I can share is I went to Ethiopia, got a chance to sit down with the president, President Taye, and then got a chance to sit down with the Ministry of Finance and basically try to understand where they are in their journey towards blockchain adoption. So if you look at Africa, generally the two main hubs right now for blockchain are Kenya and Nigeria. And everyone is talking about going after these emerging markets of Nigeria and Brazil. So this is like my running joke that they're like the fake emerging markets, right? Because Nigeria and Brazil are humongous economies. And they're just emerging because people are just thinking that the US is tapped out, Western Europe is tapped out. What's next? They go Brazil and Nigeria because they have these huge economies. But ultimately, that's not what we're focused on. Now, when I met with the Ethiopian, let's call it government and their officials, and their biggest problem is the flight to dollar. So I think there's a lot of misconstruing of how this stuff actually works and what are the reasons why people are not adopting blockchain at a government level. So, for example, in Ethiopia, there's about 2 million stablecoin holders already. But the bigger problem for them is that they have capital restrictions on access to dollars. So if you remember in Nigeria a few years ago, there's this concept of the street rate and the bank rate. So banks have a rate for FX, and then there's what you get on the streets, right? Which is the real FX rate. So there was actually a 30% spread on that. So if you went to the bank, you got a 30% worse rate than you would if you went to the streets and went to a, let's call it a urban uh, uh, foreign currency exchange, right? So we see the same thing in Ethiopia, where I was just there. It was about 13%. So step number one is, how do you get access to dollars full stop, and then blockchain. So the real question that I think we need to start asking is, how do we responsibly introduce stablecoins into economies at scale, and not just young professionals who are trying to get paid overseas, and so, okay, I'll take USDT or USDC. There's a much bigger game being played, and so that's where we are right now.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me of, because you're talking about like the younger economies and new economies. It's like when we spoke in November too, you brought up how you wanted to focus on serving the unbanked through mobile first designs. And I think the mobile first angle is a very smart one. Is that still kind of a big driver for you guys in this next phase then?
Yes. Okay. So so if you think about these different buckets of players in the space, right? There are some who they want to own the end user, right? So they want to go and do distribution, and they want to own the end user. From our side, when we're talking about emerging markets, I don't know necessarily what's important directly to someone in East Africa. So for me to go and say, yeah, I'm going to run this campaign, I'm going to run the mobile app, and that just doesn't make sense from my side. So what we're
Yeah.
doing is we're focusing on bringing stablecoin as a settle. So the whole strategic shift that we're making is that we're focusing on movement as a stablecoin settlement layer and yield layer for emerging markets, right? So what does that mean? That means that we go to these big fintechs who already have distribution, and we basically provide them stablecoin rails and eventually access to yield. But again, a lot of this is dependent on the government allowing it, right? And so you'll have some players who they'll use non-custodial wallets to try to get around it. But ultimately, if you're not working with the governments directly, it's going to be very difficult, because they can just choke the on-ramp.
Completely stop it. Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly. With the conversations with the Ethiopian president and the government there, what did they want? If you could say, like, maybe broadly speaking, what the conversation was like, or like, what are the specific needs or pain points that they're hoping to address, through these types of payment rails?
Sure. So when you think about these emerging markets, a lot of them, they speed run banking, they speed run technology. So for example, I grew up in the US. I remember we had these clunky ass desktops, and then you had these AOL disks, and then like, Ma, I'm on the internet, right? Because it was
It was
using
dialing up. Yeah.
exactly
All that
dial-up.
stuff. Yeah.
And then we ramped up to smaller, laptops, and then it became, now we use our phones, right, for almost everything. And so what we saw in these emerging markets is they kind of front ran all of that, went straight to mobile phones. So the adoption is actually pretty aggressive in these markets, but the problem is, how do they bring these new technologies again responsibly? So to answer your question, AI was also top of mind. And if you look at most governments, they actually put out 3 to 6 year prognostications and goals of what they want to accomplish across all the different agencies in the government. And so they know that AI is the truth and the future, and they understand that blockchain as a technology is the future. It's like denying internet. There's no running from it. It's just a matter of when are you going to finally accept it. And so for them, they know it's happening, but they can't afford mistakes, right? So if you look at most currencies, they're having a devaluation problem, right? And so I'm talking about just against the dollar. So for them, if they are afraid that if they give unbridled access to the masses, that there will be a flight to dollars, which will absolutely cave in their own currency. So the question for them is, how do we do this responsibly,
Yeah.
where we can, because this is a worms in a can situation. Once it's out, it's going to be very difficult to put it back in. So again, this is very much a measure twice, cut once. And so what we're doing is we're working with the government. This is just one of the teams that we're working with, about how do we roll out a potential pilot program where we can safely kind of see how things work, and then roll it out at a national scale. So those are the types of things that are really interesting to us, because for us who are in crypto, we have these chain ideologies of, oh, I'm a ETH maxi, I'm a Sol maxi, I'm a this maxi. Ultimately, these people don't care. All they care about is,
As
can I
if it
get
works.
access to stable coins? Does it work? And is it safe? And the safety is also a big point of conversation that we can get into as well.
Yeah, for sure. What are your thoughts on the front of safety? I mean, obviously, over the past few months, we had some major DeFi exploits back in April, mainly. Currently, end of May, early June,
Mhm.
fingers crossed things are smooth sailing. But, in this industry, we have exploits all the time. So, how do you think about security, especially when you're working with these emerging markets where, every single dollar counts?
Yeah, I mean, you just recently had one of the co-founders of Open Zeppelin tweet that DeFi is unsafe, and then of course
Right.
rage baited every single DeFi player in the space, saying, "No, that's not true." Even
Yeah.
Open Zeppelin themselves had to come in because they're auditors and their
Yeah.
business depends on people wanting to use DeFi. So the difference is okay. So let's think about Drift. All right. So I love Solana early in the Solana ecosystem. Again, that was my first foray into blockchain full time. Was at the top DeFi protocol in Solana, Marinade. And so when the Drift hack happened, right, it was over $250 million that's gone. I don't know. I'm going to ask you: did anyone get a slap on the wrist? Is anyone being indicted? Is there anyone in
Public shaming is about
public
the
shaming?
category. Yeah.
Yes, yes, but we've got public shaming for a million other things, right? We
Right.
get public shaming for kiss cams gone wrong. So, when we're talking about $250 million worth of assets, there is zero tolerance for loss of user funds. So when I was talking to these teams, working on a, let's call it decentralized blockchain, where essentially if shit happens, tough luck. That cannot be the status quo. That cannot be how things operate, because when people lose money, I don't know how to say it. People go to the gulag. People, like, there are real ramifications, because
Of
if you think
course.
about these big fintech companies in emerging markets, generally it's actually the telecom company. So everyone has cell phones, right? So as we talked about this mobile adoption, so let's take a step. Everyone has cell phones, right? Whether Android, iOS, it doesn't matter. They have phones and they have to buy minutes on their phones and they have to buy data. So generally speaking, in most emerging markets, the largest company is either importer, exporter, or it's a telecom company. So that telecom company has ridiculous distribution. And generally, those telecom companies are also the fintech companies, because again, they already have the distribution, they have the users, they have their information. And so my point in saying all this is that they cannot lose the user funds, because also, which is a lot of people don't know this, is that these companies are also generally run by the government, or the government has a very heavy hand in how they operate. So if you lose user funds, it's a big deal. And when I was talking to them, they said, look, one thing that we cannot tolerate no matter what is a hack or exploit. And
Mhm.
so for them, it's table stakes. So it doesn't matter whether it was Layer Zero's fault, with the RSETH, or was it Aave's fault, or was it Kelp's fault. They don't care. It just, you cannot lose user funds. And so the way that movement is setting up our security infrastructure is, we call it user-centric, retail-ready security measures, where what happened with RSETH cannot happen on Aave, cannot happen on movement. Again, this is not a knock against RSETH, it's not a knock against Aave. All I'm saying is that there's no scenario in which this can happen. And so for them, they want to understand what happens if there is an exploit. How do we get the funds back? And so those are all the types of questions that we're answering for them. And that's the plan, is to roll these out and slowly, go one by one.
Would you have a blocker then or something? How would that work in practice?
So there's a few ways to do it. We haven't finalized the structure to publicize it yet, but it's a
Okay.
lot of stuff that people have discussed, right? Having time locks, not being able to,
Yeah.
kind of do the just in Sun thing, where I deposit 1 billion and immediately withdraw 700 million in stables, not being able to enable that, because again,
Mhm.
these people, that's not a selling point. So if there is a short delay, or there's capital restrictions where anything more than $10,000, anything more than $20,000, also being able to, okay, I'll stop there. Those are the big ones.
Okay. Okay.
Essentially, like,
Well,
again,
maybe another time we'll talk
yes, there's
about
a lot
it.
of
Yeah.
legal things that we're working through
Yes.
right now. But essentially, all I can say is, suffice to say that it's enough for them that they feel comfortable, and that's our main focus, is how do we make it retail ready. So essentially, the way it works is we plug into the fintech apps, they have the distribution, and we just provide the service for them to be able to accept stablecoins across the board, and then potentially access yield products that were historically not available to their users. But again, only if it's legal.
Right. When it comes to global adoption and like the way you guys are thinking about the next steps forward on the payment front, how do you differentiate between like US, Canada, EU, and then emerging markets? Because I'm sure the conversations and the needs are very, very different. But you could probably more or less bucket, like, okay, this one bucket and this is the other bucket. But these buckets don't really like cross flow over into each other, aside from maybe like cross border payments. If I'm sending something from like the US over to Ethiopia, for example, right?
Yep.
But like, what would you say are the differentiating factors that you keep in mind when you're talking to these different economies?
Great question. So when I say that we have these licensed payment rails in the US, Canada, and Europe, it's more so of onboarding funds, but ultimately it's to serve those in emerging markets. So it is mostly cross-border payments. So if you are focused on payments in the US and Europe, you're not going to hear about movement. That's not what I'm focused on. I feel if anything, we're overserved in the sense that it's just different people finding different ways to say, oh, you can earn on your stables inside your mobile wallet, but it's all happening in the US and most people have access to that anyways.
Right.
All right, fine. The 22-year-old new grad doesn't have access to T-bills in his Chase account or something because he's not a credit investor. But is that really the problem that's going to, unlock Finance 3.0? I don't think so. So for us, we're focused on the emerging markets. Now, I know there's a lot of businesses predicated on that. I'm not hating on it, but what I'm saying is that's not our focus. Our focus, as I joke, is the countries that you can't pronounce. The countries you can't pronounce are where we're focused on, and the ones that you probably haven't visited yet. Those are the ones that we want to serve. And so we've seen a lot of interest. And again, the US leads everything. So with the Clarity Act, just knowing that the US is leaning towards that stablecoin adoption, that is huge for these emerging markets because ultimately they follow the music, as we say. It's America who plays the music and everyone else dances.
Right. Tether is also a big advocate for focusing on emerging markets. And I just did a podcast recently with USDT Zero's co founder, Lorenzo Romagnoli, and he was talking about that's one of the reasons he thinks Tether excelled, while other stablecoins kind of focused on, targeting the US or European audiences or APAC, like Singapore, where, they have good local currencies. But they were saying like we targeted emerging markets where they didn't have good local currencies. Is there anything from like USDT's kind of strategy or style that, you would want to implement or not implement maybe? Like, okay, they, scaled and did really well and became the world's largest stablecoin by, going after these emerging markets, but maybe that's not necessarily how we would do it. Or you could say on the other side, like, yeah, we like this.
Yeah, so obviously it's different because Tether itself is a stablecoin and movement we're not planning on launching
Right,
a
right, yeah. There's
coin.
some nuances here,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. But I will say that there is no doubt that currently USDT is the Coca-Cola of stablecoins. So when you go to these countries, everyone wants USDT, but a lot of them, for example, they don't really care about the chain. It's just what they know. So Tron, right? And so in a lot of these countries, they actually think that the T in USDT stands for Tron, which is obviously not true, right? It stands for
Yeah.
Tether. They think it stands for Tron. And so, but again, it doesn't matter. All that matters is do they have access to it? So I do think that Paolo and the Tether team, they're just really smart and they're really ahead of the curve. And obviously, in order to get where they are, they must be. And so even their big foray into gold, they were talking about XAUT before the big gold rush, that we've seen over the past 12, 18 months. And so I do believe that for most users, they're going to want access to stablecoins and stablecoin yield. They want access to gold and gold yield potentially, which is coming to movement. And then obviously, if they're more crypto native, BTC and yield on BTC, right? So for us, that's our main focus is being able to get those main core pillars to the users. Because in a lot of these developing countries or emerging markets, people love gold. It's something they know, they can touch it, they can feel it. But one of the problems is that they can touch it and they can feel it. So when you travel, like where are you going to hide it in your house, right? You're going to have to go to a bank, put it somewhere. My family's from Afghanistan, so we have like this brown affinity towards gold. Oh, we love gold, and people will hide it in their closets, when they go
Yeah.
travel. And these are real problems for people. And if people can get access to actual gold without having to take care of it physically and worry about its security, that's a huge win. Now, ultimately, for example, on movement, the only gold products we're bringing are ones that are backed with gold bullion. So I don't want to go into the whole history of it, but the US has a very fractional reserve type of gold market, whereas China has it's physically backed by gold market. And so for us, we're only going to bring assets that are backed by physical gold. So that is our main, because that's the only type of gold that we want the users to have access to, because the last thing on earth we want is there's a bank run on the gold and these users in emerging markets don't have access to real gold. So that's top of mind for us. And when we talk to these big institutions in emerging markets, it's a must have.
Is that a partnership on the gold front? Like
Yeah,
who's?
so we actually announced Oro. So Oro
Yes.
Gold is one of the teams that, with Usman and his team. And so they're going to be announcing some other products as well. We're also discussing with teams like Theo. So there's a few players in the space. And so we want users to be able to make that decision, but ultimately access to real gold and then potentially yield on the gold. And then the last thing I'll say is Sharia compliant. So if you look at emerging markets, a lot of them, they are Muslim majority companies. And so they cannot and they won't use T-bill yield. So how do we get Sharia compliant yield? And so we have some announcements coming up. And so obviously myself, originally from Afghanistan, although born and raised in America, I know that in order to penetrate those markets, you need to have Sharia compliant products or else you'll have zero adoption.
What does that look like? Sharia compliant.
So there's a lot of
For
there
those of us who don't know,
Okay,
Torab.
so interest, also known as usury, has been historically not allowed. So in Islamic finance, a loan is not a business; it is a favor. So you cannot make money off of loaning money, but there are ways where you can structure as a fee, or there's a few different ways where you become co-owners. And so there's all these. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on this, although I did spend a lot of time studying it. It's basically you can't just give them bond yield, right? You cannot just give them interest. So that is a non-starter. But there's a lot of products out there, and it's just how do you tokenize those, bring them on chain, and then present them to the right people.
Yeah, okay. So we brought up Oro. We talked about Cast briefly in the beginning. Movement also has partners like USDC/Circle, Avant Protocol, and there are others that are building on the network. How would you kind of categorize the interest today and the types of people or teams that are integrating with the chain, partnering with you guys, and so on?
Yeah, so we actually have invested in a few teams as well. So the one that most recently we announced was Sorted Wallet, which was also invested in by Tether. I think Tether led their round. Sorted Wallet is honestly an amazing team. So they truly are banking the unbanked, and we're happy to support them. So basically, if you look at phones, it's iOS and Android, but there's actually a third one called Kai OS, and these are simple phones. So, we call them smartphones, the phones that probably you and I have. But if there's a smartphone, there must be a not smartphone, and those are simple phones, right? As some call them and dub them. So these are phones that cost anywhere between $5 to $20. They don't have all that functionality that we have, but people use them, right? So if someone is living off $100 a year, they're not going to buy a $1,000 phone. And so these are the people that Sorted is servicing, and that's why we're honored to be able to service the Sorted team as they go towards these billions of people who don't have access to smartphones or can't afford them. And so that's the type of project that we love to support. So I guess what I'm saying is anyone who's trying to serve in these emerging markets, those are the teams that we want to partner with. And so we actually have a few more announcements coming up over the next few weeks, and you'll kind of see it all playing out, and it'll make more sense as the pieces are being put together there.
Yeah. What about other enterprise businesses or financial institutions that want to get into this space? How should they be thinking about payments, emerging markets, et cetera, if they aren't already?
Honestly, there's a huge rabbit hole that you have to go down. First of all, you have to, that saying that you have to understand the rules before you can break them. So the first thing is understanding how does everything work? Why? Almost everything that you see, it's there for a reason, right? No one just does things. And so once you understand, wait, why does it take, 5 days to send money back and forth? So, Swift was actually created in 1973. That is 4 years after man first walked on the moon. That is what 15 years before the Berlin Wall fell. It's over 50-year-old technology that the banks still use. And
Great.
so we have to understand there's a reason though why it was created and why it is the way it is. And so you have to really do a deep dive, have a strong compliance team before you even think about dipping your toes into this. And so that's what we've been focused on for the past, I would say, year, is just learning, understanding, partnering with the right teams, and then rolling out. So this is now the rollout phase.
Yeah. So how else are you thinking about supporting compliant financial products at scale for then fintechs, maybe neobank partners in these emerging markets?
You have to work directly with the largest fintech companies as like a joint venture with the government. That's truly the only way. I don't see another realistic path towards real scalability. So when we talk about scalability, I'm talking about tens of millions of users potentially in different countries. And so that can only happen when there's already distribution. But the more distribution they have, the more scrutiny they have from the government, which means that they really have to cross those T's, dot those I's, and you have to be willing to jump through these hoops with them together in order to get that adoption. So if you don't do it, then I would say you're underwriting too much risk as a business without having that backing from the government. And so that's again where our focus is.
Would this also apply then to the EU, US, and Canada as well, or we would have a different take on that?
Well, we're not focused on facilitating payments inside the US and Europe and Canada. It's more so for users, diaspora, being able to send money back home, or even B2B. So the B2B side is something that we haven't even announced yet that we're working on, is businesses being able to send money back and forth using stablecoins on movement. And so that's something that we're going to be rolling out, I'd say, beginning of Q4 of this year.
Okay. So with the new payment license and strategy set in place there, that could obviously open up a lot of doors for you guys, as we've talked about. And I know last quarter Move also announced it integrated with USDC X to its network. So for a remittance corridor like the US to send to Nigeria, or the US to Pakistan, or to something else, what does the cost actually look like for the end user moving, let's say like $100 or something? And how does that compare to existing options that maybe have existed for decades, like you talked about before?
I think the average rate is about 6%. Now, if anyone says they're going to drop it by 99% and it's only going to, like, they're lying. Not they're lying, I think they're mistaken. They're sorely mistaken.
Mistaken, yes. That's
Yes,
a nice way to put it.
because the thing is it's not going to be a hand-to-hand. Like, of course, in an ideal scenario where, the whole world is democratized and the borders melt, I can just send from my wallet to someone else's wallet, which is possible. But if you're a business or you need to be able to pay vendors, that's just not going to work, because eventually the government's going to want, ultimately the government has to be okay with these things, right? It all boils down to tax and just the currency itself. Why does it even exist? So they want to have some type of guardrails. Now, the cypherpunk ethos might scream into the ether, no pun intended, as to why this sucks. And no, we need to focus. But at the end of the day, these are real businesses, and they need to be able to, again, pay vendors and not have to deal with these kind of predatory FX fees that they're forced into. So one thing that maybe most people don't know is, in a lot of countries, when you receive funds, not only do you have to accept the FX fee that the bank gives, which again is sometimes way worse than the street rate, but you also then have to hold it in that local currency. So imagine you're a business, it's hard enough just to be successful, and then at the same time you have to hedge against the currency, right? The local currency. And so this is why in these big emerging markets you see people holding stables. It's not even that they don't love their country or anything of that, or that they're even trying to avoid taxes. It's actually because of the fact that they just want to be able to think about, what is my cost going to be next quarter, right? And so if you have to also bake in that my currency might go 10% against the dollar, but I'm paying Facebook and Google, I'm paying ad dollars, I pay them in actual dollars, I'm not paying them my local currency. So again, this is, if you're deep in it, what I'm saying is like ABCs of how the businesses work. And so this is the problems that we're seeing. And the question is how do we solve for this at scale with the support of the government?
Yeah. What do you think is the timeline for that solution?
It's country by country. There's a reason why everything is fragmented. Just like, for example, in the United States, there isn't actually a national money transmitter license. You have to actually go state by state and apply individually to every single state. And so every single country is the same way, where they have their own rules. This also makes me kind of laugh when people say, oh, we're focused on LATAM. What the hell does that mean? LATAM is a
focused on dozens of countries, yeah.
Yeah, or even like
or a dozen.
Africa, or they're all in very different places. And if you've ever been there, you'll see, like, it's very different. Things can change, at the flip of a switch. In terms of there's new leadership, and now all the rules change. And so, so when I hear these kind of big generic statements, it kind of makes me laugh. Even when I say emerging markets, I'm talking about very specific countries. I can't share all of them, but the point is they're very specific countries with very specific needs, and you have to be able to speak their language, Not literally, everyone speaks English, but you have to speak their financial and
Yes, yes.
compliance language.
Yeah. Is there any specific part of like the whole stack that needs to 100% work for everything else to matter? Like, I feel like we've covered a lot of ground here, but like, is there anything that like you're like, we need to get this done correctly, otherwise nothing else will be able to happen?
Nothing else will be able to happen. Obviously, the chain has to work. The thing
Oh
is,
yeah.
yeah, well, yeah, that's number one, right?
Yeah.
But so there's a lot of infrastructure already there. So I think the biggest mistake is trying to start from zero. There is infrastructure there, and I think every team needs to, again, soul search and say, where can I fit into this equation? And not just do it just for the sake of doing it, but how am I making people's lives better? Or how am I addressing a problem at scale for a government or for like the biggest fintech company in a country? How can I actually help them? And so if we think about solving problems more than how do we, get our, squeeze some juice for ourselves out of this
Yeah.
equation. And so honestly, that's a hard question to ask, but I would say, man, the compliance has to be there. If you aren't compliant in these countries, then it becomes very difficult
It's a
because
non-starter.
basically it's a non-starter. They will just shut you
Yeah.
down from the very beginning.
So then going forward,
Mhm.
Torab, what would you say is the biggest indicator or kind of metric you're tracking to know whether or not you're making waves on this front in emerging markets versus just like, like we've talked about, maybe joked about like telling a good story or just like getting into it to get into it, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's this whole thing about TVL on DeFi Llama, right? Everyone
Yeah.
goes to DeFi Llama, check
I've heard of
TVL.
it. Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. Is it real? Is it fake? Even
Yeah.
even stablecoin volume. So a lot of times when people talk about stablecoin volume, it's just let's say I send you $100 million, or let's say I send you $1 million in stables right now to your wallet, and you send it back to me. That's $2 million in stablecoin volume on chain. Is that real economic activity? No.
Yeah.
So is it Goodhart's law, right? Where basically once you have a KPI and a metric, it kind of defeats the purpose, and now it's not a great metric because now I'm chasing a metric that I made up myself. So for me, ultimately, it's real economic activity and being able to facilitate and solve people's problems. So if we work with the fintech app, that they can now facilitate stablecoins coming in and out responsibly with the blessing of the government, and we get tens of millions of users on the movement blockchain unknowingly. They don't even know it's the blockchain, right? If they know it's
Hmm.
blockchain, then we failed. Being able to facilitate, to me, that's winning. So it's hard to have a very specific KPI. Ultimately, obviously, we do have like trading volume, like, $10 billion in trading volume a week or a month or whatever it might be. Like that's the goal that we want to get to. But again, I can game any metric that I put for myself. It's just getting genuine adoption. So genuine adoption is our main KPI.
Yeah. I love it. How does movement's emerging market focus kind of fit into the world where so many people are focused on institutional adoption, on-chain finance? Is there a connecting point here, or is it kind of like separate playing fields?
The only place where I see that if there's a Venn diagram where they kind of intersect,
Yeah.
it would be where providing institutional grade yield to users, right? So, for example, I think I've heard this on many different, podcasts and conferences where they talk about underwriting Brazilian motorbike payments.
Hmm.
It's like that is not something that someone's going to want to use for tens of
Yeah.
millions of users. But at the same time, I actually think the big problem that we're going to see across the board, this is my hot take. My hot take is that most governments are not going to potentially allow these types of yield products in their countries because number one is if I'm a country, I want my currency to be the main currency that everyone uses. Now, of course, the US is I don't want to call them the bully, but they're the bull in the china shop that everyone knows that the dollar is king, right? And so if I have my citizens and they're all going to dollars, that's a problem, right? But the way it currently stands is most countries are not tokenizing their own currency. So that's problem number one. So only the dollar is really available. And then on top of that, I can get yield on the dollar. For most users, just having access to dollars enough. Now you add yield to that, and it's like a open and shut case. 100% they're going to gravitate towards the dollar. So I believe that it's imperative for every single government to tokenize their own currency and then put their bonds on top. So, for example, in Turkey, the lira, they actually offer around 40%. Their T-bills, their bonds are 40%. So if I'm a user and I have the option between the lira and the dollar, I'm going to always choose the dollar. And if I can now, but if I can get 40% on the lira, now this is a discussion worth having. And I believe that for every single currency to be able to compete at global scale, they have to tokenize their T-bills or their bonds, as you will, in order to compete with the US dollar, or else the US dollar is going to eat everyone's lunch. And then they're going to end up passing legislation, which is, we're not going to allow you to hold X amount of, more than X amount of stable coins, which is kind of what they do with
Yeah.
dollars anyways in a lot of countries.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that too when we were talking about this earlier, is because like if I had a local currency and everyone is kind of migrating towards dollars, that doesn't help the local currency, right? So like what is the balancing act that can exist where, we could do stable coins or US dollars, but people maybe still hold the local currency or it still maybe has value or we could bring it back value if it's not holding any right now?
Yeah,
No.
exactly. So look, I don't want to rain on anyone's parade because I don't want to be that guy.
Yeah.
As a guy who's had his parade rained on many a times, but for example, this whole we're going to bring stocks on chain and everyone in the world is going to buy Tesla and SpaceX. Look, man, these governments they're not just going to be okay with all this money because once you invest in the U.S. stock market, you're like taking a levered bet on the dollar, right?
Yeah.
So you're not. You're
It's also
100%.
moving away from your local stock market if there is one in your country or
Yeah, yeah.
something, right? Yeah.
Okay, let's forget the stock market for a second. I'm talking about
Yeah.
just pure currency, right? So you think that these governments are just going to allow that to happen? Because at that point, it's a foregone conclusion that they're denominating everything in dollars. No one is denominating, their Tesla stock in birr, which is the local currency of Ethiopia. That's not how they're doing it. It's all in dollars. So I think that a lot of these people are going to be in for a rude awakening when they actually work with these governments and try to understand what their problems are and that they can shut it down, right? And so the reason why everyone in the world doesn't have stablecoin rails is because the government's not playing ball, the central banks especially. So when I say government in these countries, generally it's actually the central bank. So the central bank has to approve it, and if they don't, you'll get a few of like the very forward-thinking 23-year-olds who are into blockchain and they have their wallets and self-custody, those types of people, but you'll never be able to penetrate into the mass market in these countries. So I do think that the big teams that are going to run into issues are the ones that are bringing tokenized stocks and then this T-bill yield. Because again, if you're bringing T-bill yield or any of these types of products, you're going to run into a brick wall of, hey, we're not going to let our local currency fly not only into dollars, but then into their T-bills. Hell no. Because it completely debases their currency. So I can go on and on about this because that's top of mind for these teams when I talk to them. They're like, okay, how do we prevent this? And so we have a blueprint that we're going to be rolling out with a few of these places. But again, these things take a little bit of time. But when the adoption happens, it's very big. So it's like that hockey stick where it's like adoption is flat and then it's going to go straight up. So that's how these things are going to work because we're working with teams with incredible market penetration and that have already solved the scalability issue.
Amazing. All right, last thing, Rob, leave us with a piece of advice, something that you've carried with you throughout your time in this space.
Okay, I would say don't take advice from people who haven't done it themselves.
The
So
advice is don't take advice from people who haven't done it themselves. All right, yeah.
yes, yes, I will say that that's been a golden rule that a lot of times, look, it's really easy to kick down a sandcastle, and you see this a lot where just generally speaking on social media, Twitter,
Yeah.
whatever it might be, negative emotions are more galvanizing. So it's a lot easier to get a million people to unite in hate than it is to unite in support. And so once you realize that a lot of people, they don't actually even mean what they say, they just think it's funny. And so I think especially right now, like the market is getting bludgeoned over the head, except for I would say hype and near, a few of these darlings right now.
Hmm.
But everyone else is getting bludgeoned, and it's easy to get kind of sad and it's over. The meme, it's all over. But
Yeah.
the reality is, there's so much opportunity out there. It's amazing that when I see these conversations, how kind of blind people are to the opportunity out there. And for me, we're in a situation where we're getting kind of too many opportunities, and we just have to focus. So for us, the biggest problem right now is where do we focus on and basically allocate all our resources correctly. That's the biggest problem that we're running into, which all things considered is a pretty good problem.
Yeah, for sure. Amazing. Well, Tarab, thank you again for coming back on the show.
Thank you. Happy to have you on and happy to see you soon.
Yes.